Greetings, this is Caroline Staten with Transition US. Thank you so much for joining our online event today. Our principal aim is to provide the practical support to transition leaders of transition initiatives across the U.S. and in other countries, to those who are mulling over starting an initiative, and community leaders everywhere that are working on resilience buildings within their locales. We want to continue to offer these teleseminars at no cost, and do ask that you consider making a donation to transitionus.org. We have very visible buttons on our website for this, so really appreciate you lending a hand and supporting us in this way. So our event today is Inner Transition for Everyone. And Sophie described this as there are two kinds of movements for change that are active in our world right now. Activists for social and environmental change focus on the big picture, society systems for living in the outer world. The personal growth movement focuses on healing and strengthening the personal and inner world of mind, feelings, and body. Each has something to offer the other, and when a transition group can include both, it has the best chance of success. And Sophie Banks helped to set up the first Heart and Soul group in transition town Totnes in the UK in 2006, and has been supporting the inner dimension of the transition movement from its center ever since. She co-founded Transition Training and has taught transition to people in initiatives around the world. She's a psychotherapist, family constellator, and I hope you'll tell us more about that, Sophie, engineer, ex-footballer, and she's interested in systemic approaches to all things. So that's who we have with us today. And thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us, and turning it over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. So welcome to everyone. I'm having the strange experience of talking to my computer screen on a lovely sunny evening in Devon in the UK, and not knowing who's listening or where you are around the world. But wherever you are, I hope you're having a good, spacious time to down tools with whatever else is happening and tune in to this and to this event. So my intention for this webinar is to talk a bit about inner transition, how I've come to understand it, having been involved in that part of the transition movement really since the beginning in 2006. So inner transition first came into being when Rob and Naresh were showing the very first films in Totnes, and things were starting to gather momentum. And a friend of mine went to one of those films, and somebody said, you know, nobody's going to change until they have to. Nothing's really going to change until the chips are really down. And this friend of mine, Hillary, was a psychotherapist, so she worked with people on choosing positive change, how we do that in our lives. And she thought we can do better than that. We can have a better understanding of how change happens and how we support that. So she went and talked to Rob and brought into being the Heart and Soul group in Transition Town Totnes, which I was part of coordinating with her. So there's been a big journey with inner transition, both in Totnes and in many other places around the world have experimented with it. In many places, people have found it difficult to get the inner transition piece either to take off, to have energy, to be a group that sustains itself, or to have it as a piece that really integrates with the outer groups. So, you know, what I've seen and heard from in many transition initiatives, that there's people doing the growing and the digging and the building and the energy projects and so on. And then there's a group of us over here that understand the need for meditation or some kind of centering practice, that are good at working with conflict or communication skills. And it's difficult to get those really busy people that are in those very practical and, you know, very wonderful groups doing great things to see the need for the inner peace. So this talk is going to be a little bit about what is inner transition, how has it kind of emerged, and then I'm going to talk a bit about what I've seen different transition groups do around the inner peace. Heart and soul groups have come up with different names. And I'm really interested, I know there's many of you on the call, but it would be lovely to hear either things that you've done that have worked in this area or questions or challenges that you're facing, and see if we can have some kind of shared conversation or sharing of questions and solutions. So that's my kind of intention for where we're going. So if you have the PDF, you're welcome to follow along. And if not, I'm not going to assume that you can see anything. So I'll be talking as if you're just listening. And my first question, and it would be lovely just to hear some voices, and please don't be shy and join in. My first question is what do you see as being the kind of themes of inner transition? So if you're in a group, what kind of themes have you explored, either within your group or as you've offered inner work into the wider project or into your community? What kind of territories, what areas of discussion or activity have people on this call actually done, or what might you think people would be doing? So I'm going to ask Caroline to open the mics and just pitch in if you've done something. Just a couple of words just to name some of the territories, and maybe you could say your name and your place as well.
Shall we have them press 1 on their keypad, Sophie? So we don't
Okay,
go on
yeah,
top
however you want to do it, Caroline,
yeah,
that's great,
so
thank
press
you.
1 on your keypad, and I'll call on you. So Catherine Sutton, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Catherine from Albany, California, and we had a training, a Joanne and Macy Day, where we did the work that reconnects a long time ago. We haven't done a whole lot since then.
Great, thank you.
And we have Susan Jordan. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Joshua Tree, California. Our Heart and Soul group has been covering meditation practices, nonviolent communication, heart math, Starhawk facilitation for collaborative groups, and that's about it.
Great, thank you.
And Simon Dennis?
Hi, Simon Dennis from White River Junction, Vermont. And one of the things that we've been working on just recently is a group of faith and practice leaders, clergy, to come together and talk about the way that community transition and sustainability is surfacing in their various ministries. And one of the big themes that surfaced is renunciation, or letting go as a path to both consciousness development and also preserving the planet.
Beautiful, thank you.
And that's all for right now, Sophie.
Okay, great, thank you. What lovely examples. So I came up with a kind of map, which you'll see in that PDF if you can see it, or if you're looking at it later. And the things that you're saying are kind of right in there. So there are tools to help us get in touch with how we're feeling. So things like the work that reconnects, Joanna Macy's work. How does it feel to be alive in this time? And dealing with these situations, being willing to be alive and awake and aware. There's a whole piece around how we have effective meetings, how we make our groups work well together. And that might be facilitation or tools like MBC, nonviolent communication. I think there's a whole territory around peace and conflict, understanding how we get into conflict and how we handle it, and what peace is and how we make peace. Another piece around personal resilience. So I imagine many of you have either been somewhere on the edge of burnout or known people in your projects or in other activist circles that have come to a place where they're exhausted or needing to really take some time out and recover. And it's a theme that I hear in many, many trainings and groups that I've worked with around the world. There's another whole piece around difference and diversity, which I think inner tools can have a lot to say to that. How do we really embody our principle of inclusion in what we do? A piece around nature connection, using nature as a resource to support us, as a place to go and take our feelings or take our state, whatever that is. And another one, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, is understanding how change happens. So there's a few others as well, but just to give you some of those flavors of what a wide territory inner transition covers. And one of the things that I've had reflected back from people who've been holding and coordinating inner transition groups is that one of the challenges is that many people bring their particular inner practice and say, I really get inner transition. Inner transition is all about this one thing. It's all about nonviolent communication. So everybody needs to learn nonviolent communication or whatever their thing is. And can I use your group, and would you like to put out my workshop that I'm running? So people can come, and often they come with very good intentions and offering their thing, at low cost or even for free. But there's something about holding the space of inner transition, about welcoming all the different pieces and keep saying, yes, it's that, and it's all these other pieces as well. So we're inclusive in how we understand and how we welcome different practices and different ideas into the inner transition space. So for me, that's one of the kind of first principles. And in Totnes, Totnes is a place that's awash with different kinds of spiritual and psychotherapy and movement practices. We've had to be really careful about what the boundary is. Whose work, what's the conditions for the work that we are going to promote and put out on our email list. So there may be questions about that, I imagine. So I wanted to just use one of these areas as an example and just kind of talk about how I've seen that working and how we've translated inner understandings into practice within the transition movement. And that's about understanding how change happens. So I could have picked another one, and there'll be questions about others. So one of the pieces that we do on the launch training is to look at models for how change happens, and in particular how people choose and are motivated to choose change. So that example that you gave, Simon, about renunciation is people deliberately stepping into changing the way that they live or the way that they do things to have a smaller footprint. But I think it's interesting to look at the stages that people go through to make that kind of change. And one way of seeing what transition is that it's an invitation to people to be proactive about choosing to really radically change the way that they live, not only as individuals but as a community. So community is about designing a different way of living at the community level of scale. So what goes on as people move from a kind of, the world view that's there in the media, that's there in many people's expectations that we all grew up with about what the future would be like, that there would be more and more material stuff and so on. How is it to go from seeing that future, holding that belief, that set of assumptions about the world, to one that says there's going to be less and less material stuff? The future that I'm seeing for my children will be very different to what I grew up with, and so on. And what I've seen in some activists who expect people, as soon as they get the factual information about the state of the planet or peak oil or other resource depletion or what's happening around social justice, as soon as they get the information about what's going on, to expect people to be able to step into a changed way of behaving. So we go from a kind of a new factual information into completely different behavior. And I'm sure many of you wouldn't expect anything of the sort and know that there's a process that people go through. And actually, just maybe we could also invite Caroline, people just to suggest some of the things that either you've gone through yourself or that you've seen other people go through as people deal with a very different kind of view of the future. So what kind of things do people need to do internally before they actually make the changes in how they behave? What kind of things, what adjustments, what changes do we need on the inside?
So press 1 on your keypad if you have a comment about this. And Nina, go ahead. Nina Lanstott.
Hi, I'm in Bristol, Indiana, and in our inner transition group, sometimes some of us would come in the midst of real grief and despair, while other people would be at a different place of saying, well, I can really imagine how this could be seen hopefully. So part of the challenge is when different people are in different emotional spaces, how do we hear each other?
Great, thank you.
And Catherine Sutton? Catherine?
Yes, sorry.
There you go.
Sophie, I really appreciate you doing this thing. I can only talk about myself. I realized that flying was unsustainable, and so I said, I'm not going to fly anymore. I'm English. All my family are in England. My granddaughter's in England. My son's in England. I'm in the States. So I went through this, withdrawing and thinking about, well, in the old days, people, when they traveled to another country, that was the last you ever saw of them and all that. And it was very harsh. And some people, wise people, I think, were saying, is this really the best thing? And yet, my principles were saying, of course it's the best thing. Can't fly. And then I listened to Charles Eisenstein one day, who came over here from the East Coast, and somebody accused him. I think he'd been in England, and someone accused him of having flown there. And he said, yes, I did. And he had this conversation, and this is a sort of change that went on inside me as I realized, what has my decision actually done? What my decision has done is made the people whom I talk to about it a little uncomfortable and kind of guilty feeling about what they're doing, which might be still going on holiday to Europe, And of course I want them to feel guilty, but do I really? And I realized then that probably I listened to Charles saying that he follows his heart, and sometimes his work demands that he go to other places, or his heart demands that he goes to other places. And so I decided I was now going to follow my heart. And I haven't actually flown anywhere since then, but I'm at least open to the possibility, and it's a very different place. It's a place of being much kinder to myself.
Thank you. Thank you. What a great story. Thank you.
And let's see, we have another. Susan Jordan?
Oh, thank you. I would really like you to address what the previous person from Indiana mentioned, that people coming into our Heart and Soul group are at different levels, some of them being in the grief and despair stage. And that's hard for me because I'm way into the hopeful move forward. And how do we integrate everyone and get everyone working at a more even level?
Okay, thank you.
And that's it for now, Sophie.
Okay, thanks.
Here we have Margaret to Cruz. You just made it, Margaret. Go ahead.
My concern is we're so addicted to stuff, and I really don't know how to help people get beyond that. My friends are still shopping. They shop for a lot of clothes, and it bothers me. So if you can address this addiction to stuff and how to help people move beyond it.
Okay. Thanks for your question.
And over to you, Sophie.
Yeah, thanks. So the question was, what are the stages that people go through, as we kind of make this transition from one way of seeing the future to seeing a very different future? And you've raised some great questions. I just want to name some of the other processes, if that's okay, and then kind of come back to the questions that have been asked. So one is, for some people, hearing the information is really motivating, and it really, gets people fired up and enthusiastic. For others, they go into grief and the despair, as one of our callers said. I've lost the name. But there's all kinds of others, and I imagine, you've been through some of them, and I certainly have. One is that there's a whole kind of identity shift. So I found, that I eat different foods to what I used to 10 years ago. I travel in different ways. My house works differently, so when people come to stay, things aren't as they expect it to be. I've lost friends through the shift in my worldview. It's become really difficult to stay in close contact with old friends of mine. And for some people, that kind of renegotiating of relationships is happening right in their household. So it might be their partner or spouse or their children who are now seeing the world really differently from them. For
Sophie?
some people, it means letting go of their job and their income and trying to find some new way to make a kind of meaningful way of working and earning a living. So there are all these different phases. So yeah, what kind of things can we do? One of the things that I find really helpful is it's simply to make a kind of frame for people. So if I'm, for instance, we do exercises on the training where we, look at all of the reasons why we need to do transition, and at the end of that invite people to say how they're feeling. And often in that we'll find that some people are really excited and energetic, and other people feel really swamped by feeling stuck or hopeless or whatever it is. And I think it's helpful to be able to just make a frame to say these are all natural and welcome responses to the situation that we're in. In terms of what you might actually do with that in a meeting, you might want to have different processes for the people that are in different places, or even just pair people up and have conversations about how it is to be in the different places. But there's something about welcoming all of it so that there isn't just one right response. And often people go between, and this happens for me, that I go between feeling excited and hopeful, and on another day I'm in the place of kind of despair or feeling my grief. And I think it's useful for people just to have all of that normalized in the way that we talk about our responses. The question that came from, is it Margaret, at the end, about how do we invite the people that are still shopping? For me, that's kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's like, how can we go on making transition be something that feels relevant and meaningful to people who are still in the worldview that there's going to go on being enough stuff, or that it's nothing to do with me. There's a whole piece on the launch training, I don't know if you've done that looks at the kind of spectrum of belief and where people are, and suggests that the people that we should most be engaging with are the ones that are already starting to see, something of the reasons for transition, that we can have the most impact where we're putting out information and reaching people that aren't, completely in denial.
Hi, I'm Dale Brady. I'm in Romney, West Virginia, and I'm going back and forth struggling with this emotional thing people are talking about. And I just wanted to say I recently read a book that happens to be by a friend of mine, and it kind of addresses the end of the U.S. culture and economy as we know it in a novel called Tribulation. and it's by Thomas A. Lewis. It's very easy to read, but it addresses so many issues that we're talking about, of how to stay positive, how to believe, how to deal with people who don't, what happens to people in denial. And it's, I think, one of the big things to acknowledge. In our transition group, we talk about this too, is to acknowledge that people are afraid and they don't know how to be. So it's kind of like lemmings. Lemmings aren't trying to run off the cliff, but they're desperately running for something. And people are doing that, and you can't really change other people, but like through the example and just being aware of their fears and confusion, and that they have to believe in the leaders of your country or your church or whatever. And I don't know how you deal with that, but to be aware of people, it's very real to them, their fears. And
yes.
Good luck to all of us.
Thank you, Dale. And Sophie, I think you're back and you heard most of that, so that's wonderful. And we have Lisa Armstrong too that is responding to your query. So Lisa, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Excuse me. A little bit of background will be necessary before I ask my question. I live in the central Arkansas area, in the Little Rock area of Arkansas, and this time last year we had an active transition group, but beyond just the inner transition component, my biggest challenge was that I'm 59 years old, and many of the other individuals in the group were quite a bit younger than me. And they were enthusiastic at first, but then they really just wanted to have a good time. They didn't want to study about transition. They didn't want to learn, it seemed, and I didn't want to be the sort of mother figure, heralding and shepherding everybody around. So there were some individuals who emerged eventually, and we had the beginnings of a permaculture project, it looked like, but then that fell apart. So I guess I'm actually going in a different direction before inner transition. How do you actually get people motivated, even if it is inner transition, to study, to get serious and commit?
So we were talking about that kind of process of change and how understanding how much of an inner process of change there is. And then for me, the next question is, so what do we do about that in our projects? What do we actually do with that understanding of how change happens? And some of the kinds of things that we've done and that I've seen other groups doing, is that the main insight from that is that we need to support this inner process. So we need to create spaces where people can come together and just be with their feelings, even if they're very different. So it's a great question. How do we create some kind of sharing process where it's fine for people to be, having in a different part of that energetic or despair phase? One of the principles that we have in Totnes, we don't always manage to do it, but one of the things that we agreed really early on is that if we ever showed any films that had a really difficult or challenging content about, like, the end of suburbia, about the changes that are coming and how challenging that might be, that there should always be time to connect afterwards, so people don't just see the film and then go away feeling terrified, disturbed, and alone with that. So there's always time to connect with others and know that other people also are being disturbed and affected, and feeling things in the response. So there's something just about how we facilitate events and how we speak about what's a natural and kind of normal way to be with this information. In Totnes, we set up a really particular project that we were able to do because there are plenty of people who are qualified therapists around, and we've found one-to-one support for some of the key activists. So some of the people who were therapists, they wanted to offer something to the project, but they didn't want to be part of an ongoing group and go to meetings. So they decided that they could donate maybe an hour of their time every month to give one-to-one support to some of the people that were holding a lot of responsibility. And I've seen some other variations of that where people have created kind of peer support. So, using something like co-counseling, one person takes some time to speak and the other one's listening, and then they swap over. So we can find different ways of supporting that kind of inner process. And that's just, for me, just one example of how we take our understandings about the inner process and apply it to our meetings or to our groups or to setting up a project within our transition initiative. I'm going to just kind of keep going with the talk, if that's okay, and then we'll have time to pick up questions at the end,
yes.
just so that there's some kind of flow to what I'm doing.
Yes, that's fine, Sophie. Thank you.
Okay. The last bit of this that I'm going to talk about is just some ideas of what inner transition groups have been doing in different parts of the world. So I did a survey a couple of years ago and had responses from about 50 groups in different places. I know there are many more groups that I didn't manage to get in contact with. So here are just some of the kinds of things that those groups are doing. So for individuals, there's things like workshops on personal resilience and burnout. As somebody suggested earlier, learning practices like mindfulness and meditation that give us a kind of inner support. Some groups have set up support groups, like in Totnes we created home groups, but in other groups they're kind of reading groups or sharing circles of different kinds. There's another aspect to inner transition, which is how do we weave it in through all the other groups and meetings. And if there's a central group, how can we support that group to have good skills around communication and good group process? Two of my favorite statistics that I say to everybody is there's a 5-to-1 statistic about saying positive things compared with the criticisms or the negative things. Some of the research shows that 3-to-1 is enough, but if you have at least 5 positive things for every time there's a criticism, you get good meetings, good teams that enjoy working together. It's also a recipe for good marriages and relationships. So 3-to-1 or even better 5-to-1 is a good ratio to have in mind, which comes from a lot of positive psychology research. And another great statistic that came from Nick Osborne, one of our trainers, is that groups that spend at least 25% of their time on process, on asking questions like, how do we run our meetings? What's our structures? How do we make decisions? How do we get to know each other? Building trust and deepening our relationships. The groups that spend 25% of their time on that or more are the ones that actually get more done in the long run. And for me, that's a really helpful counter to have that bit of research to people who want to run meetings that are just about tasks and doing. Someone already mentioned there's lots of skills that help us to improve our meetings. And I've seen a number of inner transition groups that just offer either free or low-cost skill shares. So I heard recently from someone in Fujino in Japan who's been offering just 2-hour sessions that are a kind of skilling up in things like facilitation skills, process work for dealing with conflict, and so on. And then the other kind of scale, I guess, is how do we offer things to the community? And many groups have put on films, held things like conversation cafes, and where there's a topic of conversation and people just come and there might be a short talk, or people are just invited into some kind of structure to talk about a topic. In Totnes, we've done things where we've held fishbowls and discussion groups. So a fishbowl is a structure for having a conversation that's in a circle rather than a debate, where a small circle in the middle talks about an issue. We did one about flying. It's interesting what you said about flying, Catherine. called To Fly or Not to Fly, and it just gave people a chance to kind of air the different ideas about how it feels to be flying in this time or not flying. And that fishbowl discussion invites a very kind of heartful and inclusive way of talking about a topic that might be quite charged, rather than it becoming a kind of debate about who's right and who's wrong. Many groups have, joined with other groups in their community to do nature and seasonal celebrations, and put on joint events with faith groups, like Simon said at the beginning. So those are some of the kinds of activities that different groups have done. And for me, one of the questions has been how to really bridge across, from those people who really see the inner and have skills in it, how to offer that to the people who don't see that and that's not their focus. And I think it's interesting, Hilary, who was the founder of the original group here in Totnes, sometimes talks about how much there's been a cultural split in Western society between the kind of spiritual, ethical, moral conversations, that used to happen just in the church, but, now at the realm of particular groups. So there's a kind of whole territory of inner inquiry and inner discussion. And then that's very separate from the world of science and, observation and rational kind of thinking. And these two things have become very split in our culture. So, back in the history, is it the 17th or 18th century, we actually did a deal in Europe where the church and the scientists agreed to share the territory, that they wouldn't interfere with each other's kind of areas of inquiry. And in some ways, I think that's part of our problem, is that we've lost the ability to move between kind of moral and spiritual and ethical questions and the realms of the practical. So I know when I did an engineering degree, there was no invitation at all to think about the ethical or the moral implications of anything that we might be designing or the machines that we were putting to use. So that question, how do we bridge across, I think is one of the biggest challenges for those of us who see the inner peace. And these are my kind of tips that I would say, and I'm sure others could add to this list, about how we start to make that bridge. And the first thing is to really find out what other people want and need. So, we've offered lots of workshops in Totnes for things like the work that reconnects, or discussions, or nonviolent communication. And some people have come to those, especially when we've called it things like meeting methods or how to have fun meetings. But it wasn't until I started to really talk to some of the people at the center of the Totnes project and say, what kind of support might you be needing? And I did it at a time when they'd been going through a very tough time. There was a lot of conflict with other people in the town. So my another tip is to really use those opportunities when you can see there's a need. So one of the things that came out of those conversations was offering just a very simple talking circle to talk about the feelings that had been going on, and we did it during the daytime. It was right next to the office, and people were very specifically invited that were kind of right at the center of those bits of conflict. And 16 people came to that, most of whom had never come to any kind of an inner session before that. Another thing that I think is needed if we really want to integrate the inner peace is to accept that it's going to be a long-term project, and that we're not just going to drop things in and people will kind of change the way that they see inner work overnight. So part of my journey has been to really steadily build trust with people who are in other groups, so that they see the value of what I bring, which might just be a good facilitation for a meeting or for a public event. my other tips are to make it fun, to really embody the qualities that you're inviting. And for me, this is a really deep personal practice. It may be that others of you have really got this one cracked. But for me, really embodying the qualities of balance, of feeling resourced, of not being exhausted myself, of not doing too much, of taking time for stillness and whatever my restoring practice is, feels like a really important part of what we bring, and that idea that the message is in who you are and how you are and not just what you're saying. And the last thing that I've come to realize is just not to worry that, the title of this talk was Inner Transition for Everyone, but it's got a question mark at the end. Is inner transition for everyone? And I think the answer is probably no. At some point people will be going through their own process, and many people just do that on their own. So I think it's wonderful to be inviting and to be accessible, and to be reaching out to people who we think may need the kind of inner practices and support. But I also think it's fine to accept that there are some people that will never come to any of these things. And I do have a question that says, as long as some people are attending to this piece, maybe we do it a bit on behalf of the whole. There's something about that if the feelings of grief and despair are being attended to somewhere in the field, maybe that does something for the collective, and I can't prove that, but I just have a suspicion that it might kind of work like that. So that's kind of all that I wanted to say, and I know they're very general ideas, and we've got some time now to maybe take some different questions. So maybe we could hear like a number of questions that we have, and I'm going to make some notes and just see if there are some that are common to several of you, rather than trying to give kind of answers just to the first one or two and then running out of time. So if you have, and what would be great would be, let's have the questions first, and then we can also have some time to share answers, because I know that I'm not the only one here that's got some great ideas and insights. So if we can just do a kind of roundup of questions, challenges, what's with you, what's being difficult or blocking something.
Thank you,
Okay,
Sophie.
Caroline,
Yeah, and press 1 on your keypad, and we'll start this. Susan, go ahead. Susan Jordan.
Hi, I have two things. One is you mentioned thinking about whose work you promote, and I wondered if you have some kind of vetting process or could recommend where I can find information about a vetting process to try to be fair with this issue. The other thing is, I was really interested in some of the callers. Is there any way we can connect with the other people who were part of this today? Thank you.
Thanks.
And any other questions? Please press 1 on your keypad, or any other comments. And we've got Paul Tynan. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Paul Tynan in Boston. And I was very interested if you could maybe give us the reference to the work done in skill sharing in Japan, because having worked with the Japanese and some connect with their culture, I know they believe that you can change your attitude and your spirit a lot through practice and training and sort of perfection of the arts. And I'm wondering if that is how they work that, if they sort of got people doing things, and we hear that doing things helps you to sort of calm your mind and change your own attitude by trying to sort of acting like the person you want to become, that sort of thing. I'd be curious in that reference and see if that's kind of what their approach was.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And Nina, go ahead.
Hi. My question has to do with the balance between what you might call inner work and outer work. Paul was onto this a little bit. My domain, I'm a pastor and a spiritual director, so my skill set is more the inner work. But I feel a lack of integrity somehow if I'm not equally involved in hands-on and political advocacy. But I don't know. I really wrestle with that, how to come to peace with that.
Great question. Thank you.
And Catherine Sutton?
Hello. So actually I realized after listening to you that we do a lot more than I said in the beginning, because you really are incorporating a great deal of, it seems like almost everything that isn't, well, it seems like almost everything is part of the inner transition. I'm trying to think what isn't, actually. And I think the thing that, one of the comments you made that was the most helpful for me was it's not for everyone. Because I've spent time, dealing with my own feelings about all of this stuff that's going on, thinking, oh my God, if I'm feeling like this, everybody's going to feel like this. Everybody's going to feel totally helpless and hopeless. And what can I do? I need to help them. And I realized that, they may not actually want me to help them, especially in America. There's a whole different, I think there might be something about being American where people are a little bit more independent and individualistic.
Mm-hmm. It's all over the world, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
Yeah.
Libby Baker?
Yes. At least in the U.S., it seems like a pervasive problem for everyone is how busy we are. And a lot of it seems to be around earning a living, but what I've jotted down for myself is, what can I give up that keeps me so busy? Because the busyness really interferes with making these inner changes and outer changes. And at the same time, I want to be very understanding of people who have to work even harder than I do because they have children and college or whatever. And in order to have the money they need, and not just shopping, but actually the money they need. So that's a big question for me.
Thank you,
Libby. Any other questions or comments? Press 1 on your keypad. Not seeing any more right now, Sophie. So back to you.
Okay. So I'm going to say the things that kind of come to me, but I would love it also for others to be joining in with kind of answers. So it's not just me sharing my experience and what I can see. So I'm going to kind of speak to what comes up in me in response to those questions, and I'm remembering the questions that we had before as well. So one of the things that feels like a bit of a theme is around balance, and I think balance is an interesting kind of lens to look through, not only at my own personal situation and how I make choices in my life, but at our whole culture. Like to look at our culture and to see how extremely out of balance it is in terms of what it values and prioritizes and what it requires of us. So what I see is a culture that is that requires an enormous amount of doing and busyness, and the need to earn money in order to get what we need to live, as you say, as well as all the pressure that's also put on us to buy more stuff in order to belong or look right or get whatever the other things are. That seems to me to be a really defining characteristic of our culture, is that it keeps us in this trap of busyness. And then there are other people, increasingly in this country, and I'm sure in certain parts of the States, who are unemployed, and there's so many young people now that have been unemployed for years, and there's very little prospect of them getting a job. So we create this kind of extreme between people that have very little to do and people who have way too much to do. And I think it's really fascinating that we create this culture with this kind of imbalance. One of the things that really struck me recently with our present government is that as we went into a recession, instead of saying, let's share the work round, so there's lots of people working part-time and more people have employment, people were saying, no, we need to work harder, we need to get a 10-hour day or a 12-hour day and stop having lunch breaks, like the people that are in work should be working even harder. And it seemed like, anyway, I've just been really struck with that and that question of balance and how we create busyness for myself. So it's one of my ongoing struggles, is how to not have too many commitments and not do too much. And I hear it and see it in so many people that are involved in transition. So I'm curious as a kind of structure of how it is to be human that we create that. And for me, it's a really fundamental part of the transformation that we need, is to make this balance between doing and stillness of some kind, reflection, and in transition, the balance between putting our message out and doing lots of stuff and really listening to the other people in our community about what they see and what their priorities are. So that's one of the things that comes up for me in answer to those questions. I think what you're saying, Catherine, is really true. For me, inner transition kind of is in everything. And in a way, even trying to separate inner from outer, when you really look at it, is impossible. Because at every event, Paul, like you're saying, the practice, whatever you're doing, shapes your inner world. And from your inner world, you go out into the world and act. So in a way, even the separation is a kind of artificial creation. Yeah. And I think, just staying with that kind of theme of inner and outer and balance and what you were saying, Nina, one of the things that I love about transition and the possibility that it invites is that we don't all have to do everything. So that idea that, we have these working groups, if that happens, where you can have an expertise and a kind of, that in each of those groups there's a real detailed depth of knowledge about the particular thing, and some of that is about our spiritual lives or how human being psychology works, as well as how we grow food or how we build houses or how we have renewable energy. Each group and each project has its own expertise, and then we make the whole stronger and more beautiful by weaving that together. So that's one of the real insights, and I guess what's the word? The kind of image about interdependence that transition has helped me to see is that I don't have to do it all, but that I need to create my own balance that works for me. So I don't just want to be doing inner work, I also want to be growing my own vegetables and cycling and, doing the things that other doing of transition. While my particular skill set and expertise is more around the inner. I'm a novice gardener. I'm happy to dig, but, I know that I'm skilled at facilitating, for instance. And Paul, the problem with trying to get the reference for that skill sharing project is that it will be in Japanese, but the place is Transition for Gino. And I can forward to you, there's just a little piece that someone there sent to me about how he's been running that skill sharing project. And it did remind me of something we've done in Totnes as a do-it-ourselves skill share project here in Totnes, that somebody who's just a brilliant networker has been running. And I'm amazed at the variety of skill shares that people offer, so they all have to be free unless you're paying for materials. And she's built up an email list of a couple of hundred people, maybe it's even more than that, and people offer clay making, pottery, paper making, felt making, bread making, but also, communication skills, meditation, just a fantastic mix of inner and outer things. And it's brought in lots of people from the community who aren't particularly interested in transition because they just love all these free taster workshops. So I think that kind of Skillshare idea, free Skillshares, how can we share the resources of what people know in this community, is a really wonderful way to just put everything in the mix. And with that, you don't really need to, to make any boundaries. So that's there's one or two questions that I haven't spoken to, but I'll come back to those. But I'd love to hear any kind of feedback or thoughts from anyone else to the questions that we've had, and any other comments and any other questions.
Lovely. We are getting some hands up, and invite those of you who haven't spoken yet to join us. And Joanne Lee, go ahead.
Hi, excuse me, this is Joanne. I'm in Olympia, Washington, and we've had a somewhat active and then inactive and then active again transition group for about 4 or 5 years now. I am particularly interested in inner transition. I'm a business and personal coach and have always leaned in that direction, but we don't really have an active group here right now. But from my own work and life, what I can say is I've been encouraging people to work less and create more time and space in their lives, through my work as a coach. And I've always encouraged people not to work more than 30 hours a week if possible. I know that our the sliding economic system makes that hard for lots of folks. But one of the practices that I've been doing for many years is just not to use the word busy. I don't ever say I am busy. Even when I have a full calendar, I don't say I am busy, and I make time for important things. And I get a lot of strange looks because people, assume I'm busy like everybody else, and I correct them every chance I get. And it's a simple practice, but it's really helped me.
Great, thank you.
Margaret DeCruz?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I'm in Brooklyn. There are two things. I don't know if people know about the Pachamama Alliance and the Awakening the Dreamer Symposiums, where I'm a facilitator for those, but they really bring forth what is going on in the world, and the extinctions and the inequality and all that stuff. So there are symposiums all over the place under Pachamama Alliance, Awakening the Dreamer. It goes with transition. In fact, at a transition workshop is where I learned about the Awakening the Dreamer Symposiums. So it is one way to wake people up. And they have then created a thing for people to go deeper and to become more active in the move to amend and a climate change lobby. So there's ways to help people take action. That's one of the things. And the other thing, we started a transition group here in Brooklyn, but it ended actually because New York City is so diverse and busy, and everybody's busy. But what came from it is one of the people in the group started a gift circle at an organization, the Brooklyn. Oh God, I can't even. I'm getting nervous. But anyway, a gift circle. So we started a gift circle where people just come and say, this is what I need, this is what I want, and then you go around again and you say, this is what I offer, this is what I can give, and it doesn't mean it's related to what anybody needed, but it's a way to create community and to change the economics. And then from there started a craft night, so people were coming to fix their things. And so anyway, we're not talking about transition, but we're acting in a way to transition things. And the gift circle's gotten really popular, and a community is forming from it, just people helping each other. And the other thing with our Awakening the Dreamer group, we have conference calls. Everything we do, we start with a centering, and it's very spiritual, and we share, and it just has created this wonderful community. Anyway, I highly recommend that organization. Thank you. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Margaret. And Catherine Sutton, go ahead.
I'll forfeit my turn if somebody else is waiting.
There isn't anyone with their hand up at the moment, so go right ahead.
All right. So I want to mention resilience circles, and I've sort of changed the format. They came from the East Coast, and they were about, alerting people to what was going on, educating people, creating mutual support, and supporting people to take action is their initial focus. And so we had one here. We had two here. And I started but it wasn't quite local enough for me. So I've started a much more local one, just in my neighborhood. And we've decided, and I love this idea of do it ourselves instead of do it yourself. Do it ourselves Skillshares. And the idea of an emailing list. We were sort of moving in that direction, but I hadn't seen clearly where we could go with it. We meet, when we had our first meeting for this new resilience circle, some people said they didn't want any more meetings, but they wanted to learn stuff. And some people said, yeah, they did want the meetings. So some of us meet monthly, and we're working our way to. We realized there were a lot of skills within just the number of people that were in the room on the first day. We are working our way into sharing those skills with each other. But I love the idea of making it broader.
Great.
And gifts, and we have a potluck monthly, and we do a gift circle at the potluck, and I really do love those as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. It's funny with the gifts, with the potluck, people come who I never see anywhere else, but they come because they're feeling the need for other people. They're feeling the need for, just hanging out with other people. And that, I can see how that's meeting a need.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Catherine. And we're getting to the end of our time as well. Wanted to quickly ask a question and then turn it over to you, Sophie, for closing thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to just ask if there was a query a short time ago about participating with each other, getting your contact information. So if you would like your contact information shared now there's 25 participants on the line remaining. If you'd like your contact information shared with people who have been on this call, press 1 on your keypad. And if you would not like your contact information shared, press 2. So if you would like to hear from others and just be getting an email or two, press 1, and press 2 if you prefer not. And then I'll take it as not by anyone that doesn't press either number. So thank you, and wanted to give you time, Sophie, for some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Caroline. I just wanted to come back to one of the other questions, Susan, you asked. How do you set the boundary around whose work to promote? And we came up with a kind of policy in Totnes that said either people need to be offering things that are really closely connected to core themes of inner transition. So that's things to do with linking planetary crisis or community resilience with some aspect of inner work. So if it's just inner work on its own, that's not enough. And the other possibility is that people are offering inner work and they make it free or very low cost or by donation to people that are involved in transition. So that's just our example, and I imagine others have come up with other kind of solutions. My main concluding remark is it's really lovely to hear from you, and I hope this call has been an opportunity to get ideas from many different places. I feel like I'm a kind of channel, and that's part of my job is to be one of those cross-pollinators that hear stories and can pass them on. And I hope some of the stories I've been able to share from other places have been useful. And for me, every time I hear another story, I'm really interested to hear about gift circles happening in different places, and that the Skillshares idea is interesting. So every bit of feedback on these calls for me is really useful, and like the kind of bumblebee in open space, or one of those pollinating insects. I feel like I'll be in lots of other conversations, and we'll take your ideas and questions and thoughts and suggestions on to other places. So yeah, I hope those of you who want to can stay in touch. For me, these kind of calls and these possibilities of sharing ideas is just so helpful, and especially in an area like in a transition that can be quite hard to grasp and to kind of pin down, because it is so broad and can include so many things. So thank you all so much for joining and sharing your ideas, and go well with whatever you're doing.
And thank
you. Want more, if you want to see, I have a blog and write on Rob's blog sometimes on Transition Network, if you want to see more of the things that I do. But thank you.
And
Thanks,
thank you
Caroline.
so much, Sophie. And